We're beginning chapter 21. General system failure calls for a revolution. I find it hard to imagine that a system this corrupt can be a good thing, or that it is worth the vast amounts of money spent on it. If an improvement in human health was our primary aim, some of the billions currently invested in expensive drugs to lower cholesterol of the world might be far more efficiently spent on enhanced campaigns to reduce smoking, increase physical activity, and improve diet. Mo- Moinai? Damn, this sounds like Moynihan and Castles in Selling Sickness. Our drugs kill us. Our drugs kill us on a horrific scale. This is unequivocal proof that we have created a system that is out of control. Good data are available, and what I have made out of the various studies that is around 100,000 people die each year in the United States because of the drugs they take, even though they take them correctly. Another 100,000 die because of errors, such as too high dose or use of a drug despite contraindications. A carefully done Norwegian study found that 9% of those who died in hospital died directly because of the drugs they were given, and another 9% indirectly. Since about one-third of deaths occur in hospitals, these percentages also correspond to about 200,000 Americans dying every year. The European Commission has estimated that adverse reactions kill about 200,000 European Union citizens annually at a cost of 79 billion euros, which is somewhat less than the two other estimates, as there are about 60% more people in the EU than in the United States. In 2010, heart disease killed 600,000 Americans, cancer 575,000, and chronic lower respiratory disease came third with 140,000 deaths. This means that in the United States and Europe, drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. The true number of drug deaths is likely higher. In hospital records and coroner's reports, deaths linked to prescription drugs are often considered to be from natural or unknown causes, as they may be impossible to trace. For example, many drugs cause cardiac arrhythmia, which is a major cause of death in people treated with antipsychotic drugs. In previous chapters, I have estimated drug deaths in relation to some particular drugs, not in any way systematically selected, but the data support the finding that the drugs are a major killer. The use of inferior drugs for hypertension is estimated to have caused heart failure in 40,000 patients in the United States. At the peak of their use, antiarrhythmic drugs were likely causing about 50,000 deaths every year in the United States. By 2004, Refacoxib had likely caused about 120,000 deaths worldwide because of thrombosis. By 2004, Celecoxib had likely caused about 75,000 deaths worldwide because of thrombosis. NSAIDs likely caused about 20,000 deaths every year in the United States because of ulcer complications. By 2007, olanzapine had likely killed about 200,000 people worldwide. In addition to all the deaths, millions of people experience serious, disabling drug injuries every year. It is always difficult to separate causes of death, as several causes may contribute. Tobacco results in many deaths from heart disease and cancer, and if we look at tobacco as a separate cause, it comes up to about 44,000 deaths each year in the United States. Thus, the number of drug deaths is roughly half of the number of tobacco deaths. The main reason for the deaths are far too permissive drug regulation, over medicalization, polypharmacy, too little knowledge about the harms of drugs, and thousands of warnings that no doctors can possibly master. Human errors abound in the system that is far too complicated for the human brain to handle. Imagine if airline pilots had thousands of little buttons in the cockpit at their disposal, and that, furthermore, these buttons interact these buttons interacted in unpredictable ways. If several were switched on simultaneously, analogous to a patient who is on several drugs. What we will need are radical changes. Most importantly, we need to demedicalize our societies with the same reasoning that no one would dare fly if the pilot's actions had unpredictable effects. Every one of us can contribute to demedicalization by being conservative about drugs. If you don't absolutely need a drug, then don't take it. We rarely need drugs. We are rarely in situations where a drug may save our life, or where a drug can make a major difference to our lives. Most of the time, the drugs don't have any positive effect on us. A systematic review showed that stopping antihypertensive and anti antihypertensive and psychotropic drugs. I fucked all that up. Starting over, where is the beginning of this sentence? A systematic review showed that stopping antihypertensive and psychotropic drugs in the elderly generally went very well. And for the latter group of the drugs, it resulted in fewer falls and improved cognition. Selling drugs to healthy people who don't need them is how the industry has boosted its profits. It's like a cancer that has grown uncontrollably in society for many years now, which is nourished to a large extent by organized crime, scientific dishonesty, outrageous lies, and bribery. We need to stop this. Journal editors know where the evil comes from. According to Drummond Rennie, deputy editor of JAMA, the pharmaceutical companies, by their arrogant behavior and their naked disregard for the well-being of the public, have lost our trust. The FDA, by spinelessly knuckling under to every whim of the drug companies, has thrown away its high reputation, and in doing so, forfeited our trust. Rainey has also noted that, as soon as they left their positions as editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine and the BMJ, Jerome Cassiere, Marcia Angel, and Richard Smith each bemoaned the appalling influence of drug company money on the morals and practices of their profession in a book. In contrast, our politicians understand so little that they usually only make the situation worse when they act. Keeping people healthy is not a priority in America's profit-driven system, which thrives when people are ill. The propaganda has made nearly half of all Americans believe that the United States has the best health care in the world, albeit with a clear political divide, 68% of the Republican and 32% of the Democrats. The beliefs that what is good for Big Pharma is also good for the people, and the market forces will solve all problems are contradicted by the facts. The United States has the most ineffective healthcare system developed in the world. The three countries with the lowest healthy life expectancies, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, are former communist countries. The United States has a relatively low healthy life expectancy despite the fact that this country uses far more resources than any other country. Show you a little graph they got here. Pause to get a longer view. A 2008 report from the Commonwealth Fund found that the United States ranked last among 19 industrialized countries across a range of measures of healthcare. The report estimated that if the United States attained the same performance indicators achieved in other industrialized countries, at least 100,000 lives and at least $100 billion could be saved each year. And it tied much of the problem to a weak base of primary care doctors. A study that compared 3,075 US countries found that 3,075 US counties found that every 20% increase in primary care physicians was associated with a 6% reduction in total mortality. The relative position of the United States on health indicators among OECD countries also worsened in the period where the proportion of specialists increased. The waste in the United States is gigantic in relation to the size of the population. The United States spent 2.7 times more on drugs than European countries in 2000. And yet, or perhaps because of this, the outcome is much worse. The data in figure 21.1 are about 10 years old. Currently, the United States is even worse off than in the figure, as it spends about 18% of its gross domestic product on healthcare, which double as much as in other industrialized countries. The health disadvantage of Americans is not only because of extreme income inequalities and widespread poverty, it is also seen among those with a health insurance, a college education, higher incomes, and healthy behaviors, even for deaths considered amenable to health care. Americans fare poorly. The decline in amenable mortality in 19 industrialized countries averaged 16% over a 5-year period, whereas it was only 4% of the United States. What is also striking in figure 21.1 is that there isn't any relation between the amount of money spent on healthcare and life expectancy. The United Kingdom has come to resemble the United States more and more, as it has moved toward greater privatization of healthcare. Its healthy life expectancy is lower than in most European countries, and its prevalence of chronic disease and disability lies between that in the United States and the rest of Europe. Such sobering facts tell us so clearly that capitalism and privatization impact negatively on public health, and that they explain why the vast majority of European doctors are left-wing when it comes to healthcare. We feel nervous about profit taking any role in the career professions, even those of us who might be right-wing for other political issues. We love our public health service, which U.S. politicians scornfully call socialized medicine. How much medicine do we really need, and at what cost? We waste huge amounts of money on drugs where the patients would have been better off without them. Hypertension is a good example that one cannot just look at the benefits of prevention. When investigators asked how it went for 75 patients with controlled hypertension, their doctors said they had all improved, whereas only 36 of the patients felt that they had improved, and only one of the relatives said so. The questionnaire, completed by the relatives, rated 22 of the patients have... Wait a minute. The questionnaire, completed by the relatives, related 22 of the patients to have suffered severe adverse changes, undue preoccupation with sickness, decline in energy, general activity and sexual activity, and irritability. The reason why all the doctors were satisfied was that none of their patients had made complaints. Screening for hypertension doesn't seem to have any beneficial effects, whereas it may have untoward consequences. Wait a minute. It may have untoward, untoward consequences. I would say untold, but untoward. Okay. A 1984 study of Canadian steel workers showed that those labeled as patients with hypertension through screening had increased absenteeism from work and suffered a decline in marital adjustment. And in the fifth year after screening, they earned $1,093 less than colleagues who 5 years earlier had comparable wages. This effect on income was seen even in those who didn't take their antihypertensive drug. We should also consider that the arteries become more rigid with advancing age and that lowering blood pressure in the elderly may lead to vertigo and falls. In a study where the elderly were their own control group, start of antihypertensive medication increased the risk of hip fracture by 43%. A quarter of those who suffer a hip fracture die within 1 year. For example, from pneumonia or thrombosis caused by immobilization. A professor emeritus of cardiology said, "Let's not turn elderly people into patients, but let's allow them to enjoy being healthy. For example, free from drugs." It can be life saving to treat seriously elevated blood pressure at the adverse effect of drugs we use are therefore a minor issue. However, harms of drugs are actually the same for patients who are seriously ill as for those who are not. The benefit harm balance may therefore change from beneficial to harmful as we move toward treating people who are healthy but happen to have an elevated risk factor. It's very costly to treat all these healthy people and give them an insurance that their risk of some unhappy event will be a little less if they take the drug for the rest of their lives. As no one subsidizes the insurance on our house or car, we would discuss whether it's reasonable to use taxpayer money on drug insurance. Economists use a concept called willingness to pay. If it costs €3,000 to treat one person in 5 years prophylactically, and this prevents one untoward event for every 30 people treated, what would a person then decide if he was to pay himself for the drug insurance? Would all 30 happily pay the €3,000 for a chance of 1 in 30 to win the lottery while enduring the side effects of the drug for 5 years? I'm pretty sure some would prefer to use the money for a vacation or something else. At least I would. If we use medicines rationally, we would have much healthier populations at a fraction of the expenditure we currently have on drugs. In 2012, the top 50 companies sold $610 billion in human prescriptions on pharmaceuticals. I have little doubt that we could have easily saved 95% of this, which are annual savings of $580 billion, as many of our highly used drugs are 20 times more expensive than equally good alternatives. And as we are so much overtreated, imagine what we could do for $580 billion. Only 17 countries in the world have a gross domestic product greater than this. I don't think I exaggerate. Others have estimated that more than $200 billion may be wasted on unnecessary treatment every year in the United States. And although this waste includes treatments other than drugs and poor administration, it's one of the same order of magnitude as my estimate. and yet it refers to only one country. Although the drug industry, wait a minute, for profit is the wrong model. Although the drug industry already suffers from corporate obesity, it pushes its drugs to medicate us even more. In 2002, a report from the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies identified 20 diseases and conditions for which they thought potentially achievable benefits were not achieved. The report warned against undertreatment over 98 pages, but none of its 184 citations were to systematic reviews, although there were many for each of the conditions discussed that could have dampened the hype. For each disease, positive studies were quoted and negative studies were ignored. Not a single study of overtreatment was quoted. Providers of goods and systems also get their share of the cake. Healthcare and pharmaceutical executives were 4 of the top 10 best paid executives in the United States in 2010. The top earner, John Hammergren, was chief executive of the drug distributor McKesson Corp, with total remuneration of $145 million. If the poor guy were to be fired, he would receive $469 million in severance pay, or 10,000 times as much as the median household income. What can one say about such obscenity? Well, at least we can see what's wrong with the United States' culture of unlimited greed and cheating. The average ratio between CEO compensation and employee is about 13 to 1 in Germany and 11 to 1 in Japan. It was also 11 to 1 in the United States in 1970, but now is a staggering 531 to 1. The US bonus system creates a minimal incentive for innovation and a huge incentive for fraud. In large drug firms, the value of unexercised stock options held by the top executives is often larger than $50 million, which creates an incentive to increase the stock prices and then take the money and run. Unfortunately, the Americans seem unwilling to solve their most fundamental problems. This hits the rest of the world with the global financial crisis in 2008, after all brakes on high-risk investments had been removed by foolish politicians guided by equally foolish economists who believe the market will solve all the problems and regulate itself. I'm sure we'll soon run into a worse global recession than in 2008, again caused by the United States. This is a bit odd, since so many Americans are devout Christians. The Bible warns against unlimited greed in so many places that it cannot be overlooked. Here is an example of the consequences of the perverse incentives we have. Adventists developed a drug against cancer, eflornithine, but it didn't work for cancer, whereas it was highly effective for sleeping sickness. Since patients with sleeping sickness are generally poor, Adventists discontinued making the drug. Later, it turned out that eflornithine was an effective depilatory. The drug went back into production and was now made available to Africans with sleeping sickness at little or no cost, the only reason being that many women in the Western world want to remove facial hair. The control of medical practice by market economics does not serve the needs of the patients very well and is not compatible with an ethically based profession. Business imperatives Yeah, business imperatives to make profits do not produce the social benefits claimed by the market advocates. Research in the United States has consistently found higher costs, lower quality of care, and higher rates of medical complications and death. Wait a minute. And higher rates of medical complications and death in for profit facilitates than in public facilities. Even billing fraud is far more common in for profit hospitals than in not for profit hospitals. Our universities have also jumped on the bandwagon with their university industry partnerships and patients obsession with patents. This is detrimental for public interest science. For example, studies of occupational hazards and many other types of non drug prevention of disease have no commercial interests. It is inherently immoral that drugs can be patented. We can avoid buying patented merchandise if we think it's too expensive and will suffer no harm in contrast. We may die if we cannot afford to buy a patented life saving drug. The right way to go with drugs is to abandon the current system and replace it by nonprofit enterprises that invent, develop, and bring new drugs to the market. Several capitalist countries have established state owned drug companies, and it was suggested in the UK in 1976 that the government should take over sections of the drug industry. This didn't materialize, but in 2007, the Medical Research Council announced that it planned to do this to speed advances against rare diseases. As long as we continue to endure the for profit model, we could introduce an award system where drug companies, instead of patent monopoly, would receive a financial award when they have obtained marketing authorization, the size of which could be related to the degree to which the invention represented a breakthrough. After that, the drug could be licensed to multiple firms to manufacture and sell at generic prices, which would ensure that also many poor people and countries could afford to use the drugs. The WHO Global Strategy and Plan of Action on Public Health, Innovation, and Intellectual Property of May 2008 and the EU Council conclusions on global health in May 2010 both called for needs driven innovation and for further exploration of innovation models that delink the cost of research and development from the price of medicines to encourage both needs driven research and more affordable access to essential medical technologies. Such delinkage would address three weaknesses of the current model of medical innovation: unaffordability, unavailability, and unsuitability. It would also dramatically reduce incentives for development of Me Too products and the marketing and promotion of medicines that are used irrationally or that are no better than the alternatives. Clinical trials. We cannot trust industry trials at all, and the reason is simple. We don't trust a person who has lied to us repeatedly, even though that person might tell the truth sometimes. The industry has broken our trust, and it has an enormous conflict of interest. Further, drug companies choose investigators that have long standing relations with the drug industry and don't ask uncomfortable questions. To allow industry to do trials on their own drug is like allowing me to buy my own judge in a court case. Imagine if I were accused of a crime and turned up in a court with boxes containing 250,000 pages of evidence for my innocence that I had produced myself, which is about the volume of clinical documentation for a new drug, and that I told the judge This was the only evidence there was on which he or she needed to make a verdict. I would be thrown out of the court. It's very strange that we have accepted a system where the industry is both judge and defendant. As one of the most firm rules and laws of public administration is that no one can ever be allowed to be in a position where they shall evaluate themselves. The fact that drug agencies will look at the submitted material cannot compensate for this transgression, as the evidence has often been deliberately distorted in ways that escape detection. The industry should no longer be allowed to carry out clinical trials, but they could provide funds for academic led trials that would be vastly cheaper for industry. The European Society of Cardiology has estimated that university centers can perform drug trials for about 1/10 to 1/20th the cost industry trials, where there are numerous for profit middlemen who tack a hefty surcharge. Similarly, the National Cancer Institute has estimated that it can do trials for little more than the usual drug cost. The last trial I conducted was a multi-center trial of 112 patients with rheumatoid arthritis that were treated with disease-modifying agents or placebo for 6 months, and the budget for the trial was less than my monthly salary. We bought the drugs and got the placebos free from the companies. This shows that the trials can be done at almost no cost if doctors want to do them. The premises for our current system are wrong. Capitalism operates on the principle that private risk yields either private loss or private wealth. But the idea that public risk, patients participating in trials, is turned into private wealth is a perversion of the capitalistic ethic and an exploitation of patients. We need a major culture change where we see clinical trials as public enterprise, done for the public good and performed by independent academic institutions. Academics can also be biased or bribed by industry, but such problems can be solved by ensuring effective blinding during data analysis and writing of manuscripts. And no, wait, this was how I did randomized trials. I analyzed the data under code and produced 2 different manuscripts. The code wasn't broken before my co authors had approved both manuscripts. While we await a major system change that may never come, we may do our own independent trials of new drugs before we decide whether or not to use them or reimburse them. In the Netherlands, legislation in 1979 enabled the minister to restrict certain technologies to certain hospitals while they were being evaluated by systematic reviews of the literature. A fund was created in 1986 of about 16 million euros a year with the effect that new unevaluated technologies, including drugs, were reimbursed only when offered as part of a properly designed research study to assess their effects. In other words, randomized trials. Funds for independent trials could be provided by taxes. The drug industry makes huge profits based on publicly funded research and reimbursement of drugs, and it would therefore be reasonable if the industry was taxed to an extent that allows academics to run the trials we need, where we compare a new drug against the best available treatment before we decide anything. If we taxed prescriptions with as little as 2%, it would quickly create a large fund for such research. The Italian Drug Agency requires drug companies to contribute 5% of their promotional expenses apart from salaries, which has created a large fund used partly for independent clinical research. There are similar initiatives in Spain. Funds may also be provided from government or hospital budgets, as independent trials could easily become a source of income rather than an expense. As long as we are running a trial where only half of the patients will get the new expensive drug, we will save half of the drug costs. And when will and when we are done, we will more often than not discover that the new drug has nothing to offer. The requirement of independent trials before we make decisions would have a tremendous impact not only on the public purse, but also on public health. It would no longer be profitable to develop endless numbers of Me Too and Me Again drugs, and the industry would be forced to do innovative research instead of spending its money on marketing. Revival of the Norwegian medical need clause would also reduce the amount of Me Too drugs. Norway had only 7 NSAIDs on the market compared with 22 in the Netherlands, but its medical need clause was eliminated in 1996 when it harmonized its drug approval process with that in the EU. As there isn't much price competition anyway, it wouldn't matter much for our drug expenses, whether were 7 or 22 drugs of the same type, but it could mean a lot for innovation. My ears are cold, I'll be back. It is cold. Yeah. Oh crap, where was I? I'm just gonna start here. The requirement of independent trials before we make decisions would have a tremendous impact. No, wait, I was already right here. Yes. Here we go. Independent testing of drugs would also mean that we could compare new drugs with old, cheap ones under fair circumstances, where the old drug is not given any dose that is too high, so that the manufacturer can falsely claim that their drug is better tolerated, or a dose that is too low, so that the manufacturer can falsely claim that their drug is more effective. There are also far too few comparisons with non-pharmacological interventions. When a study found that a program of exercise and weight loss was better for preventing type 2 diabetes than metformin, 56% and 31% effect, respectively. The only thing the Wall Street Journal wrote about was the effect of the drug. We also need much better and honest reporting of harms, which we'll never get in industry trials. Although the first thing we know about any drug is that it may cause harm. A survey of 192 reports of trials of at least 100 patients showed that the space devoted to harms was 0.3 page, which was similar to the amount of space devoted to contributor names and their affiliations. Finally, the rationale for a proposed clinical trial must be based on a rigorous, recent, systematic review of all previous trials with similar drugs, with meta-analysis if possible. This will often tell us what looked like conflicting results in previous trials. I gotta start that over. This will often tell us that what looked like conflicting results in previous trials are not at all conflicting. If this isn't done, Many unethical trials will be approved, as the type of drug might already have been shown, or could have been shown, to be either life saving or harmful. Such a requirement was introduced in Denmark in 1997, but for reasons unknown to me, it was quietly taken out when the law about trials was revised. The Research Ethics Committee, the Research Ethics Committees have failed miserably to pay attention to what matters most to patients. They have done nothing to ensure that the trials they approve are ethical, that the informed consent forms accurately depicts the state of knowledge and uncertainty, and that the results of all the trials become publicly available, although this was pointed out to them in a well-argued BMJ paper in 1996. We won't get rid of industry-conducted trials for a long time, but in the interim, we could decide to let the regulatory authorities select those clinicians who would be allowed to test drugs instead of industries picking of the most willing doctors, who are also those that are easiest to corrupt and most likely to keep quiet about industry's manipulations of the evidence. Patients should also know everything about money involved in trials and investigators' conflicts of interest. If doctors are uncomfortable about this, they have something to hide, which makes it even more pertinent to ensure transparency. Protocols and contracts with drug companies should be publicly available so that we can all see whether to trust our institutions. It's a sad fact that many still accept gagging clauses, and also that, when authors solemnly and routinely declare in journals that they had access to all the data, it is rarely true. Drug companies should be required by law to deliver placebos for independent research at no more than the manufacturing cost as a condition for having a product on the market. It should also be obligatory for companies to deliver the pure drug, for example, in powder form for independent research. If drug companies want to be part of society, they must be willing to further public health by letting other researchers do research on their products. Trials come to their full fruition when assembled in systematic reviews, and such reviews should always tell the readers how many trials, outcomes, and results might be missing, and also to which extent the reviewed trials were sponsored by the manufacturer. Here's a good example from the Cochrane Review of Hypertension, where the plain language summary aimed at patients says, most of the trials in this review are funded by companies that make ACE inhibitors, and serious adverse effects were not reported by the authors of many of these trials. This could mean that the drug companies are withholding unfavorable findings related to their drugs. Prescribing at least expensive ACE inhibitors in lower doses will lead to substantial cost savings and possibly a reduction in dose-related adverse events. Finally, seeding trials should be made illegal, as they now are in the EU, European Union. The directives of pharmacovigilance, the post-authorization studies, was amended in 2010 to say, studies shall not be performed where the act of conducting, wait a minute, studies shall not be performed where the act of conducting the study promotes the use of a medical product. Drug regulatory agencies. Drug agencies have a major responsibility for the many drug deaths. They approve many dangerous drugs and use fake fixes by issuing an enormous number of warnings and precautions, although they know perfectly well they won't work. We would never accept it if airlines crashed several times a day, the year round, because their construction made them too difficult for pilots to fly. We would never accept it if airlines crashed several times a day, the year round, because their construction made them too difficult for the pilots to fly. Okay. We need a revolution in drug regulation. Drug agencies need to become evidence based and realize that the current system isn't working and cannot work. They should reject far more drugs and require sufficient safety data. Surrogate outcomes should not be accepted. I have given many examples earlier, and in this book, how terribly misleading surrogates can be. The patients may be injured or die while their surrogate improves. Cancer drugs are such a disaster area. The regulatory requirements for cancer drugs are close to none. They are often approved based on single-arm studies that cannot say anything about whether the drug increases or lowers mortality. Of 27 different indications in Europe, of which 14 were new applications and 13 extensions of earlier approvals, the clinical documentation consisted entirely of small single-arm studies in 8 cases. The total number of patients was small, a median of 238, and in half the cases, only surrogate outcomes such as complete or partial tumor responses were provided, although they are highly prone to biased assessment, particularly in single-arm studies. This is very worrying because most cancer drugs may cause both tumor shrinkage and increased mortality. For example, if given too high a dose, those drug studies that did report on survival found a median difference of only 1 month. Another study of 12 new cancer drugs approved in Europe from 1995 to 2000 showed that none of them offered any significant progress, and yet one costs 350 times more than the competitor. It's even worse at the FDA, which approves most cancer drugs, 68% based on outcomes other than survival. In addition, 35% of drugs were granted a license even without a single randomized trial. Based on public data, I have calculated that 33 years of randomized trials in solid tumors sponsored by the UK Medical Research Council hasn't led to any progress against cancer on average. It was a large material, 32 trials comparing one treatment with another, and 6,500 deaths, and the mortality on the new treatment was the same as that on the control treatment. The other cancer surveys have confirmed this. For example, for 57 trials of radiotherapy, the relative risk was 1.01, and for 126 trials in childhood cancer, the odds ratio was 0.96. Zero progress against cancer. On average, it means that this is very difficult to find new treatments that are better than those we already have. Rarely, a new treatment is better, and rarely, it is worse. As long as our drug agencies don't require mortality data from randomized trials, they will allow harmful drugs to be introduced on the market without anybody knowing. Relevant patient populations, comparators, and outcomes. Patients above 65 years of age are routinely excluded from industry-sponsored trials. For example, only 2% of patients in NSAID trials where 65 years or older were 65 years or older. Although these are the pa- Although these are the patients most likely to take the drugs and most likely to be harmed. Exclusion of these age groups also makes it difficult to detect harms caused by the combined effects of taking many drugs, polypharmacy. The EMA recently announced that they will from now on expect the age distribution of patients to be representative in studies presented for marketing authorization. This is good, but still not enough, as drug firms can still write in their protocols that a condition for participation is that the patients don't receive other drugs than the trials drugs, than the trial drugs. And I don't have more and don't have more than one disease. I'm getting cold. To ensure the drugs are tested in realistic settings, which isn't the case today, a survey showed that common medical conditions formed the basis for exclusion in 81% of the trials, and patients received commonly prescribed medicines were excluded. In 54% of the trials, such exclusions were significantly more common in industry sponsored trials. According to the Helsinki Declaration, a new drug must be tested against those of the best current proven intervention, and placebo should only be used when no such intervention exists, or where there are compelling and scientifically sound why can't I say this word? Methodological reasons for the use of placebo. For example, when current treatments have doubtful effect. I therefore believe drug agencies should require relevant head to head comparisons against commonly used drugs, and that when placebo is needed, they require that some of the trials have used active placebos to reduce the risk that they approve useless drugs. Safety. Let's see how many pages I got left. The current practice, where drugs are approved based on only 500 to 3,000 patients in short term trials, even when the drugs are to be used for decades, sets the stage for major drug disasters, which are very expensive because of legal fees and settlements. These costs are subsequently added to the price of other medicines. Apart from identical twins, people are genetically different. For example, in how quickly they metabolize a drug or how susceptible they are to its effects. It is therefore expected that for most drugs, some people will react very badly. These reactions can only be detected reliably if many patients are studied in randomized trials. If, for example, a drug causes fatal liver failure in one patient out of 2,000, even a trial of 20,000 patients may not detect it, since we would only expect to see 5 liver failures in the 10,000 randomized to the new drug. We might have seen none at all if that drug is an analgesic to be used in, say, 50 million people. 25,000 of these will die of liver failure, although they didn't need the drug, as there are so many other analgesics. This won't happen in practice, of course. The drug would be withdrawn long before the 25,000 liver failures, but if it had been an increase in heart attacks, we might never have found out, as so many will get a heart attack anyways. Anyway, drug agencies should require much larger numbers of treated patients before they make any decisions, and they should also require that trials run over several years if the drug is to be taken for years, as harms may take time to develop to get valuable new drugs on the market if requirements were tightened doesn't hold. There are years between such an outstanding drug and the fact that drugs are the third most common cause of death says that more than enough about the current system. If post-marketing studies are required because of remaining safety concerns, it's essential that these be conducted by and commissioned to, as part of the regulatory approval, independent investigators. Companies have every reason in the world to blindfold themselves by conducting poor studies, to fail to report them, or even to do them. All clinical data must be publicly available. It's a terrible misconception that a company can own clinical trial data. According to the European Ombudsman, data and results belong to society for obvious reasons. Patients don't volunteer for trials and run a personal risk to benefit the shareholders of a particular company. They do so to contribute to science and help improve treatments for future patients. If we accept that companies can claim ownership to trial data, we also accept that it's legitimate to exploit patients for commercial benefit. It's obvious, isn't it? It's ob- it obviously isn't and wouldn't violate the Helsinki Declaration. We should therefore force companies to make all their trial data available, including raw and anonymized data in statistical programs, which is what the EMA intends to do for the new drugs. We should also use our muscle, for example, deciding not to recommend drugs or not buy them until all the data have been made available. UK law makes it possible to take legal action without notice and to delay approving the company's pending drugs, or even to withdraw a marketed drug if the company refuses to provide all the data. Confiscation of the company's patient confiscation of the company confiscation of the company's patent is another penalty that is under consideration. If a company abuses a patent by marketing a drug for a purpose it has not been approved or tested for, why should it then continue to benefit from the exclusivity? Health Technology Assessment Agencies should follow the lead of the German agency IQWIG and refuse to assess a drug until all data are provided from all trials without any conditions about confidentiality, so that the public can also see the data. As suggested by the Danish Drug Agency, there should be full public access to all documents in drug agencies, including data from toxicology studies. Drug companies should be required to submit all documentation in easily searchable formats. For example, text recognizable PDF files. The agency should check that the files are completed and include all documents listed in indexes, and the files should be made publicly available. US legislation from 2007 ensured that the data bank at clinicaltrials.gov would be expanded to include all phase 2 and subsequent trials, and the results information would be added after the product had been approved for marketing. The restriction to marketed drugs needs to be removed. However, as unknown harms of the drug might lead to unnecessary experimentation and additional harms of similar drugs in the future, the 6 healthy volunteers in the United Kingdom who nearly died in phase 1 trial is a case worth reimbursing. Above all, There should be no redactions, which will require changes of some national laws. We should not accept receiving documents from drug agencies that are so heavily censored that they look more like military intelligence documents than drug studies. And where all the harms of the drug have been wiped out, which we experienced when we received study reports of a slimming pill from the Danish drug agency and on SSRIs from the Dutch agency. An additional problem is that the redaction is arbitrary. Sidney Wolf, director of the Public Citizens Health Research Group, said, I've never been able to get any kind of protocol for what FDA staff are instructed to redact, but in general, they redact way more than they should. He added, of course, it's a catch 22 because if you don't know what they are redacting, you can't argue that it should not have been redacted. Alistair Wood, the head of the FDA's Advisory Committee on the Safety of the COX2 inhibitors, insisted that there is no reason ever to redact clinical trial data, absurdly without knowing what information is being withheld or the rules guiding redaction. The interpretation of what constitutes a trade secret seems itself to be a trade secret. We also need laws requiring firms to disclose all knowledge of. We also need laws requiring firms to disclose all knowledge about their drugs and research data, and that not only allow but require drug agencies to publish what they know. Currently, the companies may not disclose anything, even when they know that their drugs are harmful. I'm gonna truncate this chapter a little bit. I'm a little tired.